Professor Myers is going to be speaking about sort of lessons, more or less, for U.S. cities from Africa. So picking up on some of the themes I think that have already come up. Garth Myers earned a Ph.D. in geography from UCLA with an allied field in urban planning. Myers has an MA in African area studies with geography and urban planning as a major and minor fields, and a BA with honors in history from Bowdoin College. He has taught at the University of Kansas, University of Nebraska-Omaha, Miami University, Ohio, California State University at Dominguez Hills, and UCLA. So he's been all over. He's comfortable with large lecture classes and small seminars, and I thought this was wonderful. His teaching philosophy rests on a belief in student engagement. The best learning, as we know, takes place in engaged classrooms, and that's something we've been talking about in our pedagogical sessions as well. Myers has conducted research in Kenya, Tanzania, Malawi, Zambia, Senegal, South Africa, Finland, and the UK over the past 20 years, and he regularly uses this research to inform his teaching. So we welcome Professor Garth Myers.
Thank you. Well, it's nice to be here. Coffee really helps. I didn't want to do my third cup before I talk because, you know, that point, I'm sure as teachers you have that point where you've had too much coffee. And it's, well, for me, I have reached that point, and I think I'm just going gangbusters and talking brilliantly, and actually no one understands a word of what I'm saying. So and I'm also coming from a workshop at the Posse Foundation in Chicago because I am beginning a role as a mentor for the Trinity students who are coming from Chicago through the Posse Foundation. Thank you, as Posse scholars, and it was a great experience to be in the workshop, but the highlight of it was meeting the 10 students that I'll be working with who come from disadvantaged backgrounds from the city of Chicago. So it is, as someone who's focused my research on urban Africa, this last couple of days was yet another example of the sort of commonalities and threads of connection between what's going on in Chicago for these young men and women and what's going on in the places that I study. I wrote myself a little blurb to read out to you before I get into my actual talk, because I was listening to Martin and I was thinking we could very easily overlap, and we edited a book together, and so we have sort of had mind meld moments in our career, and some of the things that Martin said are very much what I would have said too. The first thing though is, and I say this every time I speak to remind myself and whatever audience I'm talking to about Africa, I say Africa is huge, diverse, and complex. As a continent, the 48 states of the United States fit inside the outline of the continent 3¼ times. So it's a massive continent. It's diverse. We have more than 50 countries. We have more than, depending on how you count, conservatively more than 1,000 languages. Other people will say more than 2,000 languages, and these are very different languages from one another. So it is not the case that these are dialects. People will make a statement about the Bantu languages, and there are more than 800 Bantu languages, that these are different dialects. And I'm fluent in Swahili. I have made a stab at learning Chinyanja. It's not a dialect of Swahili. There's about 20 words that are the same, but some of them mean something else. So it's about as different as, you know, as French is from English. You know, there's commonalities between those two languages, but just because I speak English does not mean I know French. So I remind myself of that, especially today, because I'm making a lot of general remarks about African cities, and then looking at the lessons for U.S. cities and the themes that tie over. And so I'm assuming most of you are coming from the U.S., maybe not of a U.S. background or U.S. born, but I would assume many of you are teachers in the U.S. And just think for a minute of how different U.S. cities are from one another. and then multiply that by 50, or at least by 3 1/4, to contemplate how different African cities within one country or within any of the 50 countries are from one another. And I've done research of some depth in 8 of the cities of Africa, and there are more than 50 cities on the continent with more than 1 million people. And some of the ones that I've worked in are not cities of 1 million. Worked in Zanzibar, Dar es Salaam, Dodoma in Tanzania, Nairobi in Kenya, Dakar in Senegal, Lusaka in Zambia, Lilongwe in Malawi, Cape Town in South Africa. And I've done some in-depth research and written about some other cities that I haven't actually been to, Lagos, Accra, Kinshasa, Abuja, and Thiès in Senegal. So I'm continually humbled by how much I don't know. I've written 4 books and co-edited 2 others on urban Africa, the one with Martin as well. And these have covered the gamut. My most recent one that just came out is called Urban Environments in Africa. And so it's a look into some of the issues you were talking about in regards to climate change or air quality. But I also have written a book about solid waste management in Africa, and a book about colonial influences in terms of urban planning. And get this, Martin, you know this because I think you've praised it. A book called African Cities, which several of my friends have chastised me for. But it was to my I guess I would say it was my inattention to the insistence by the publishers that I title the book that way because they could market it. Because there is this thing called Africa, and they have cities, so they're African cities, despite the diversity and complexity. So I'm always learning alongside all of you. I just got back from the Pearl River Delta in China, southern China, cities of Guangzhou, Dongguan, Shenzhen, and Hong Kong. And one of the things that I was doing there was examining and talking with the African communities along the way. And Guangzhou has the largest community of Africans in China and probably in Asia. On any given day, there's probably about 100,000 Africans in Guangzhou. There's more likely about 18,000 to 20,000 permanent residents of African origin. But even in that community, it's an incredibly diverse and complex community. Each little part of the Guangzhou African community has its elections. They elect their own presidents. By far the largest, about 49% of the population is, no surprise, what country do you think? Nigerian. But by most people's estimates, the second largest population is Congolese, and not coming from the Democratic Republic of Congo, but coming from the former French Congo, the Republic of Congo, and the third largest from Mali. These are not countries that have a long-standing record of relations with China. These are not countries that are connected over 1,000 years of trade with China, like Kenya or Tanzania would be. There are various reasons behind it, but when you go into these warehouse centers and you see the clocks on the wall telling you what time it is, it's Beijing, Bamako, Brazzaville, maybe because it's all B's, but that's who's interested in what time it is. So that surprised me. I was not prepared for that, even to contemplate a Malian trading community of that size. It certainly is something I expect and see in Senegal. So my lesson from this is to be mindful as I talk for you and for myself of the unfinished quality of what I'm talking about, the speculative nature of all of the understandings that I'm going to give you. And this is a particularly provocative sort of talk that I wanted to give, especially given what's happened in the last few days. I'm going to start, though, someplace else other than China or other than Hartford. This comes from the political scientist Nick Cheeseman, who's at Oxford. And as Britain was voting on whether to exit from the European Union, which they eventually did. But before the vote had actually taken place, Nick Cheeseman, who works on Africa, wrote this brilliant satire of how this would be covered if it were happening in Africa. And I've just got this little segment here. The divisive language used by a number of political leaders has revealed deep tribal and regional cleavages and shown a new light on the country's fragmented and incoherent national identity. In a state that is yet to do away with its royal family and allows unelected traditional leaders to wield great influence through its legislature, that's his typo, not mine. Of the many overlapping ethnic and regional cleavages at play, one of the most significant is the ongoing tension between English nationalists and Scottish secessionists. So you can see where it goes from there. It's a rather long and involved and detailed essay. It's actually well researched. And it's dead on, because this is how so much of the rest of the world looks at Africa. And so following on what Martin had to say, we see the sort of perceptions and perspectives that people from outside of Africa have on Africa's cities as being different, as being other, as being not quite cities or not real cities. They don't work. And some of what I loved about that video that Martin showed is just to say, just slap you in the face and say, look, it's a city. You know, it's got the same problems that other cities have. Maybe some new ones, maybe some different nuances of things. But let's sort of strip away the othering process that takes place when anyone mentions Africa. So what I'm attempting to do is to look at cities the other way around. And I look at this way because in urban geography and urban planning, urban studies in general, the city I just came from and arrived at 2:30 in the morning from, Chicago, is ground zero. You study the Chicago School of Urban Studies. If you're like me and you had advisors like I did at UCLA, then you move to the LA School, which is where I got my Ph.D. So, strangely enough, there's not really, in sociology there is, but not in geography. There's no New York School, which is weird because it's the bigger of the three. But it's cities like London and Paris and Chicago, Los Angeles, that give the prevailing notions and models and theories and ideas of how cities look, how they grow, what happens in them, and why, the patterns and processes of urbanization. So that's fine. That's where a lot of our thinking comes from. But that's not where the world is today. That's not where urbanization processes are taking place. Hartford added, between 2000 and 2010, I think they added 116 people to the census number. And meanwhile, most of the world's most rapidly urbanizing countries are in Africa. And having just come from Hartford's sister city, I'm not making this up, of Dongguan, which, how many people have ever heard of? One. It's not a city that very many people have heard of, but 30% of the world's shoes, 30% of the world's shoes are made in Dongguan. Cities stuck between Guangzhou, Hong Kong area. And that's Hartford's sister city because whenever that relationship started, they were about the same size and similarly, industrially based. Now Dongguan has 8 million people, and Hartford has 125,000. So when we look at cities in Africa, we look at cities in China, these are the places where cities are happening, cities are changing. And what happens if we just change urban studies? We start thinking about cities not in relation to the Loop in Chicago or Manhattan, but let's think of them in terms of what's happening in Echo Atlantic Village. That's the model of urbanization, good or bad, that's happening in the world. So Are there lessons then from Africa? So most of the time in urban studies, all the lessons come from China. All the lessons come from London or Chicago, and they're passed into China and Africa. And this literally happens. Cities that I've studied, like Nairobi or Dar es Salaam, their first official master plans were under British colonialism. They were based on the London Plan. So, these are literally the ways in which urban planning was established in Africa, was through a colonial lens. So if we turn this around, what do we see? On the one hand, I think we should acknowledge there are potential ways in which you could argue for these cities in Africa being incomparable with cities in the United States. That certainly has been the trend that I saw. People very puzzled in the urban geography of the LA school with what I studied. My Swahili book was called by a major professor in the geography department at UCLA Lilliputian, because he looked at it and it just looked like some language from Jonathan Swift. I've never forgotten or forgiven him for that. And he certainly is one of the main voices arguing for incomparability. There are some points here. U.S. cities are definitely wealthier than most cities in Africa as a whole. There's a whole lot more infrastructure, industry, and municipal service provision that happens in most cities in Africa, most cities in the U.S. in comparison to cities in Africa. There are a lot of people who study global and world cities, and they make these statistical analyses of the impact of globalization in cities around the world. When they first started doing these in the 1990s, there were no African cities at all, and then they slowly plugged in Johannesburg. And then over the last decade, with an onslaught of criticism from people like Martin and myself, they've included more and more African cities. But they use the Global and World Cities group at Loughborough University in the UK. They use Greek letters, okay, so another element of Eurocentrism. So they have alpha, beta, gamma cities, and they have alpha plus, alpha, and then alpha minus. So it's just like grades, right? But with the Greek letter system. Guess where the African cities are? There's, Johannesburg will crawl into that A minus, right? If you're lucky, Nairobi, I think because it's got so many UN headquarters offices, it's a beta city, But most of the African cities are either in the gamma category or they're in this sort of thing that I call honorable mention, like they took it pass fail and they get, they get listed as, they have some globalization happening, but, we're not going to really study them. You look at airline traffic, you look at foreign direct investment, all the sort of main trappings of globalization in Africa's off the map. That's a potential reason why it would set up to study African cities differently, or to say, well, they're not really a part of this story. And a third one is when you look at cities in the US, you see in many cities a broad process of deindustrialization, some of which is linked to suburbanization and the spread of industry into suburbs, some of which is linked to the spread of urbanization to places like China. I'm betting that those shoes that are made in Dongguan 50 years ago were made in Maine, were made in New England somewhere. So deindustrialization is a big story, suburbanization, a big story of U.S. cities over the last, certainly of my lifetime. And you look at Africa and you see rapid urbanization, you see a lot of downtowns that still matter. Yes, there are these new sort of gated suburbs being built, but suburbia of the Western European or especially North American variety doesn't seem to matter quite in the same way in Africa. Certainly most of the poor of urban Africa live in in edgy areas that we would call suburbs. So those are potential areas for incomparability, and I'm not going to deny that there are differences. They certainly, definitely exist, but I think there are a lot more commonalities, the patterns and processes have a lot more to do with each other. There are a lot of economic, social, and cultural processes that I see as being similar. And today I want to take you through just 7 that I picked out. These are just the 7 I'm interested in. There could be others. And the way I take it through, there are biases that come into it because I live in Hartford, because I work in Hartford, and then I have experience in the 8 cities that I have. So some of what I see may be because of the cities that I have worked in Africa. So that's why I put it at the bottom there to say it's my African urban studies perspective, not really necessarily common to everybody else. This is what I call, and I think it's still legitimate to call, an article that I published 2 years ago, the unexpected comparison. Because when people do a comparison of cities, it's typically of cities that are seen to have things in common, that are seen to be similar enough to be compared, or they provide this contrast, but they're on the same page. So the more famous studies of the process of globalization by sociologists like Saskia Sassen will be studying Tokyo, London, New York. Somebody else might study, New York, Chicago, Los Angeles, because those are cities that are viewed as having things in common to study. So it's an unexpected comparison to say, let's compare Nairobi and Hartford, or let's compare, Johannesburg and New York. These are not typical in urban studies. I think when we do that, we have a lot of lessons to learn. And I say this specifically because I live in what is one of the most divided cities in the United States, as you'll see, and I'll talk about, and one of the most divided cities in the world. And yet when you hear about Africa, and you hear about Africa's cities, you hear about this incredible poverty, you hear about this incredible new fancy malls being built, so there's incredible inequality as well as incredible poverty. That's the sort of defining feature of what a lot of people will see or say or talk about in relation to Africa. So if that's the claim to fame, then why aren't those the cities we study when we come back to Hartford and say, gee, why do we have 42% of the children living without health insurance, and we have 45% of the population living in poverty, and we have all of this violent crime? What are the ways in which we can study a city like Hartford coming from Africa? And again, my bias comes into it because as an urbanist, my career has been studying cities in Africa. It's not been studying cities in America. I've just lived in them. So the first aim of my comparison is really just to illustrate that these are comparable situations. And here are the themes that I plugged in. And I'm going to go through each of them in some detail. But colonialism, and I put it in post here. I also will talk about it as neo-colonialism, poverty and inequality. And then thirdly, an underfunded, corrupt local government. Fourthly, violence and insecurity. But then I try always to come around to a much more balanced view of things, particularly because there's so much of African studies that has fallen into what is called Afro-pessimism, this notion of the failings and the dystopian visions of Africa. So I always am mindful that that's not the experience I've had in Africa. That's not the experience that most Africans have. And so I look for some other things to talk about in relation to connecting African cities with a city like Hartford. And these are the 3 I have here: spiritual and metaphysical cityscapes. cities of innovation and creativity, and then cities of cosmopolitanism and transnationality. I think these are features that really define every city I've worked in Africa, and they certainly define Hartford. So here I've got post and neo-colonialism. I don't know how much all of you have learned this week or know already, but every country in Africa except for two experienced formal European colonialism. Anybody know what the two exceptions are? Ethiopia and Liberia. And just think about those exceptions a little bit, right? Ethiopia was occupied by the Italians for a 7.5-year period, and Ethiopia as an empire was circumscribed because they lost the territories they claimed of Eritrea and Somalia and Djibouti and half of Kenya to the incursions of colonialism. So they were certainly affected. The independent country of Liberia lost about half of its territory too to colonialism, and it itself was founded by outsiders. And so it has within it a very divided society between people who have names like Charles Taylor, the former dictator of Liberia, who was a cab driver in Boston and graduated from Northeastern University in Boston. So that's not necessarily something that's absent of colonialism in its own right. So pretty much you can say everywhere across the continent there's been an influence of colonialism, and even 50 plus years now after independence, most African cities live with that hangover because those cities were built for the purposes or transformed for the purposes of colonial rule, to exploit those territories, to extract resources. The infrastructure, I always use railroads because the railroad lines, until the Chinese started building new railroads in Africa, the railroad lines all around the continent, other than South Africa, go mine to a port, mine to a port, mine to a port. Or, plantation area to a port, plantation area to a port. That's it. There's no connecting railway lines. There's no interstate highway system of most African countries because the colonial regimes didn't invest in that. And then I always take my students through the chocolate bar because in any given year, West Africa produces more than half of the world's raw cocoa and like one chocolate bar in a billion. And then take the Snickers bar into it. The peanuts, the sugar, it's all coming from Africa, but the bar itself is produced. So we talk about French roast coffee, we talk about Swiss chocolate or Dutch processed cocoa, but the products themselves are all Africa-based. So Africa's cities live with that sort of colonial hangover. But you know what? So do many American cities, if we think about it in a different sort of way. And it's especially poignant right now to think of Hartford in this way, because Hartford is very staunchly and strongly a Puerto Rican city. And Puerto Rico just was signed over to an oversight board that most of my Puerto Rican friends view as neocolonial. That is deciding on Puerto Rico's future. And the connections of Puerto Rico and Hartford are very strong. One of the few places outside of the continental United States that you can fly to nonstop and direct is San Juan from the Hartford airport. And then you have all the other Caribbean people from Jamaica, from Trinidad, from Dominican Republic, who make up a significant population within Hartford. And then I'll just throw in, since we're still in Connecticut, many people from Connecticut will know this, but other people may not. Again, depends on the revenues, and they've been following, but a sizable percentage of the state budget of Connecticut comes from the revenues paid into the state budget by the casinos of the Pequot and Mohegan reservations in eastern Connecticut. So even the indigenous people, who are virtually non-existent in the demography of Connecticut, still play a major role in the funding of the city. So there are ways in which this notion of colonialism and post-colonialism that is so dominant in the understanding of Africa's cities is very relevant, to my mind, to cities in the U.S., and cities like Hartford. Poverty and inequality. There's a measure that we use in development studies and in economics. It's called a Gini coefficient. I'm not going to get into the details of it. Some of you will probably have seen this before. It's a measure of income inequality. It can be used to measure other forms of inequality as well. But income inequality, and it's normalized to a number between 0 and 1. And so most of the countries in Western Europe, when you look at the Gini coefficient of income inequality of the cities of Western Europe, the number is somewhere around 0.3 to 0.4. There are no cities below 0.3 in the world that I can think of any significance. You're always going to have inequality. So 0.3 is considered to be a very low rate of inequality. Many cities in Africa have a rate between 0.3 and 0.4 in their Gini coefficient of income inequality. The major exceptions are in Southern Africa, South Africa especially. Gini coefficients of income inequality in South Africa lead the world, more on the scale of 0.61 in Cape Town, but that's actually down from where it had been. Under apartheid, these numbers were 0.75, 0.78. So just unbelievable levels of income inequality. But most African cities are more in that 0.4 range. Most US cities are above 0.4, and we happen to have a number of the highest cities of inequality in the United States right around us. And I'll get to that in a minute. But Hartford, which has a lower Gini coefficient than some other U.S. cities, certainly Bridgeport, Fairfield, which is the most unequal urban area in the United States on most measures. But Hartford is also a place with a metro area that's very massively wealthy. And there have been measures that have come out that show it as one of the world's wealthiest metropolitan areas. So what might not show up in the Gini coefficient for the city itself shows up when you look more broadly at the spatial inequalities of the city, which are very much, to me, like you would see in Africa. So Nairobi has a Gini coefficient of 0.57. The most recent one for Bridgeport is 0.543, but it had been at 0.57. New York City, which is one of the top 5 unequal cities in the United States in income inequality, that's equal to Accra. And when we look at South Africa, which is off the charts, but we see cities in South Africa having the Gini coefficient going down. They have lots of problems in cities in South Africa, but as Martin was suggesting, with that rising middle class black population, that's a key feature of decreasing the Gini coefficient. So if we're concerned, as it seems to be in the United States, with inequality as a rising issue in our cities, why not look at a place like South Africa? Not to say cookie cutter, let's take what they did and do it in Connecticut, but let's say, what lessons are there for cities in the United States of a society like South Africa, and Brazil is another example, where you have declining Gini coefficients? Are there any things that have been done there that seem like not such a bad thing? This just gives you a little map of that. You see some cities around us. New Haven's not so hot, a little bit lower than Hartford, and then Fairfield at the top of the charts. And there are other measures and other elements of this. As I said, you have more than 40% of the population living below the poverty level. In Hartford, you have, by some measures, half. It's gone down to about 40%, as I understand it, because of Obamacare. but somewhere above 40% of all children lacking health insurance. And this is Hartford, Connecticut, which is the insurance city. It's one of the most, if Hartford shows up on those charts of global and world cities, it's for the insurance industry, obviously. So when we look at cities in Africa and we say they're unequal and there's severe issues of poverty, what can we take from those cities and apply in Africa, I mean in Hartford? Just to give a spatial, because I'm a geographer, the spatial aspect of this, this is a rough outline of the boundaries of the city of Hartford. And it's very fundamentally divided between a black north and a Latino south, with a scattering of white population, a very, very tiny Asian population, and a white west end. And the suburbs, overwhelmingly white. 78% of the metropolitan statistical area of Hartford is white, and about 14% of the city itself is white. We see a spillover effect as growth of black middle class in the United States leads to cities like Bloomfield and Windsor to the north of Hartford becoming significantly, the school systems in both of those cities now have a black majority. So we have right, in our own state here, a very significant case of segregation, which is something that, as a scholar of colonial influence, was a very clear and deliberate tactic of British colonialism in Africa's cities. Was it so clear and deliberate in the United States? It seems something to contemplate. And then we get on to the corrupt and underfunded local government. Let me first talk about Africa. We have long cases of people just failing to get funding in cities. The city of Dar es Salaam, when I interviewed the city commissioner about 12 years ago, showed me a chart where they had never, ever, in the, at that point, 7 years of existence of the city commission, they had never received more than 76% of the money budgeted to them by the United Republic of Tanzania government. And that budget was never enough. In my solid waste management book, one of the things that, again, this was the director of the dump pointed out to me. This is a city where they received all sorts of accolades around the world for their solid waste management program. That's why I studied it in Dar es Salaam. It went from 3% of municipal solid waste, residential solid waste, being collected and sent to a landfill to 40%. And in my interview with the dump manager, he said, well, let's be real here. We're not doing all that well. Think about it. What happens to the other 60%? And you see it everywhere. It's burning around you. It's in every ditch. And he said, and it just says 40% or 43% goes to a landfill. Let's go to that landfill. I'll show you what that landfill is like. And it's not a protected landfill. Nobody working there has any protective equipment. You have just horrific things leaching into the water supply right from that landfill, which is on fire. So these have real consequences in people's health every day. And I like to talk about garbage. Most people don't, but to me it's sort of a way into, if a city works, its garbage is being collected, and people are not dying of diseases that are easily preventable if you collect the garbage. So in those contexts, most of the time, African cities have been forced into privatization schemes of one sort or another, not as extreme as what Martin was talking about earlier, but in the sphere of solid waste, the World Bank and the donor nations all came in and said, what you got to do is privatize this. You got to have companies that collect solid waste. And it sounds great when you come from a capitalist country and you've been raised in a society where, oh, duh, of course, there's a garbage man. He comes with a garbage truck from a company that's contracted to a city, and they collect the garbage and they take it away to a nice landfill. Most African cities have a sizable percentage of the population living in informal settlements, which don't have roads, which have paths or alleys that are not wide enough for those trucks. So the first thing that all those programs had to do was to start community-based enterprises that would have wheelbarrows to collect the waste. And then they had to have collection points to get the waste out of those neighborhoods. So I'm not going to bore you with the more garbage stories because I realize, you know, it's not lunchtime yet, but I don't want to ruin your appetite. But they very rarely worked. And in the case of Dar es Salaam that was so highly praised, people very closely involved in it would admit to me in an interview it didn't really work. And I come to Hartford. You see corruption at every level in Africa, and as Tony Blair, I'll give him credit, put it in his report on Africa, where he more infamously said Africa is a scar on the conscience of the world, pointed out that when we talk about corruption, we have to recognize that corruption comes in all different forms. If African governments are taking bribes to allow development, that means that European companies or Chinese companies are paying those bribes and expecting to, and are a part of that system. But the level of waste that goes with this is staggering. This is from the Nyayo Monument in Nairobi, which is just across the road from Kibera, which Martin was talking about, that is considered by some people the sort of poster child of an African slum. Has at least 300,000 people living in a postage stamp area. And right across the street, you have what the former dictator Daniel Arap Moi built as a monument to his philosophy, which is Nyayo, the footsteps. But most of the opponents of his regime would say, yeah, the footsteps following behind us and oppressing us. But you see, you know, it's aping the Washington Monument. This is Iwo Jima Memorial, you know, and it's gone to waste now. But there was an incredible amount of money spent on this sort of monumentalization of Moi's regime. The main national central park of Nairobi, about half of it was taken up by the ruling party to build their headquarters. It was going to have another massive monument, many stories high, to Daniel Arap Moi, only prevented through tremendous amount of grassroots work led by Wangari Maathai, who won the Nobel Peace Prize in part as a result of her fight. I live in Hartford now, and I don't know how many of you follow the news, but there's been this ridiculous series of cases. The former mayor was a graduate of Trinity College, Eddie Perez, is fighting his jail sentence for corruption, along with the former governor of Connecticut, John Rowland. There's a long stream of this. This is why people call it corrupticate. Right now, you have an effort. Hartford had a Major League Hockey team. They lost it. And there's been this effort to get back, you know, sort of Major League sports. Can't do it, so they're going to go for a minor league team. Building this park, Dunkin' Donuts Park. And it is not completed. Looks a little bit more completed than I thought it would have when I Googled a picture of it. But it's stalled, and the team that is calling itself the Hartford Yard Goats will not play a game in its own park this year. It was built in the North End. It was built through all sorts of neoliberal schemes. It was largely opposed by the people of the North End. There were lots of promises of jobs and development for the North End, all of which are predicated on all of the hotels and retail and restaurants and residential developments that would go around the park, none of which has even broken ground, and probably none of which will. And then the other fiasco was an attempt to bring Major League Soccer to Hartford, renovating a stadium. And a man came and proposed that he was going to renovate the stadium. They would play in the what's it called, the indoor soccer league for the first 3 years, and then the stadium would be done, and it would only cost, I don't know, $770 million, and the stadium would be done. He took his $1.2 million for the development that he would develop, and he was gone. And then is when the city discovered that he'd already served 2 different terms for embezzlement. So, you know, I think when we talk about corruption in African cities and we talk about weak local government coming from the United States, it's a little two-faced. And we have a lot of questions, a lot to answer for in U.S. cities when we see the level of weakness, underfunded school systems in our cities. And then, you know, lo and behold, we're going to make statements about Africa's cities having been underfunded. Violence and insecurity is something that I think most people would jump at about Africa, that's a, you know, a very common theme. And this is a sort of testimonial to that in Nairobi that I think is really very touching. It's the memorial to the embassy bombing. This is a spot where the Al-Qaeda organization blew up the U.S. Embassy in 1998. There were 200 plus usually most of them women, at a secretarial college next door in a building that you showed in the slides, next door that still exists. It sort of half collapsed, and so more than 200, mostly women, secretarial college students died. And I think the way in which America has memorialized 9/11 is really incomplete without the recognition of the first version of that devastation, which occurred on the heads of Kenyans. And certainly Nairobi residents recognize that, highlight that, and bring that home as a means of expressing solidarity with New York and connection to New York. And yet, New Yorkers, I think, for the most part, don't even think that way at all. And we have a spate of urban violence in the United States. There's been rising crime in a number of cities, and violent crime in Hartford certainly spiked up last year and has continued to be high. And we have the incidents of the last few days. I like to point out from my own research that Black Lives Matter everywhere. And that I think when we look at the level of police injustice in Nairobi, in Zanzibar, which is going on every day, in Johannesburg, these are connected. And I see my friend John Selders, who leads the Moral Mondays group in Connecticut, he's the associate chaplain at Trinity, is going to Brazil to make that exact point, to say that, you know, Black Lives Matter in Brazil as well. And I think it's another way that we can raise this conversation to talk about Africa's cities belonging in the same framework of discussion about issues of violence and insecurity that we see around us. Okay, so I've got about 5 minutes left. Is that right? Okay. So I'm going to spend at least 5 minutes talking about happy things, or a little more positive things. Many of my friends in cities in Africa are very religious, but roughly equally divided between Muslims and Christians. Even those who follow other religions tend to be very religious. Most of the continent is very strongly spiritual. And it's an overwhelming experience in an African city. When you live there, whether it's during the month of Ramadan in a Muslim city, or in the season around Easter in a Christian city, or both in cities that are both, like Dar es Salaam. And it's lived in an everyday way, and it manifests on the landscape. And I just have two brief examples of this. In Senegal, there are a number of different Sufi spiritual groups. About 90% of the population of Senegal is Muslim. And there are two major Sufi spiritual brotherhoods that dominate the country. The second largest of these is actually the more famous one, and this is the Murid Brotherhood, because the Murids are the ones who are most active in sending out traders around the world, and they tithe, so they send money back home to build the spiritual capital of the Murid Brotherhood, which is a city called Touba, a couple of hours north of Dakar. And the founder of the Murid Brotherhood is a man named Amadou Bamba, who also happens to have been the founder of the movement for Senegalese independence. And once you start to know his image, you see Amadou Bamba everywhere. And this is you know, Father Bamba. Even some of you will remember the Richie Valens song that was then redone in the movie about him, La Bamba. That was a massive #1 hit in Senegal, because people just naturally said, oh, of course in America they would sing about Bamba. So Bamba is unknown outside of Senegal in that song, but is, you know, an incredible hero to the Senegalese, and his image is everywhere as a sign of the spiritual Sufi belief system. This is a little harder to read. It's a garbage dump, so you can see I'm a little obsessed. This is one of those slabs where you have the wheelbarrows going through the settlement to pick up trash, and they were told to put it in this open space because it was accessible by a one-lane track by a garbage truck. But as you can see, garbage trucks did not come. The trash is burning. You can't really see them, but there are a number of Indian house crows, big, huge black and white birds eating the trash. And it took me a while to kind of unpack this and talking to people, but you'll see in the background this small tree. This is a tamarind tree, which is called a kikwaju. And the neighborhood is called Kikwajuni. So this is the neighborhood of the little tamarind. And this particular part of the neighborhood is called Mzimuni, the haunted place of the ancestors, which is right there. So you're never going to get a garbage truck to pick that up, because these are offerings to the portal to the underworld that lies underneath it. And if anybody in the German Development Service had talked to anyone who lived there, they would have said, yeah, it's an open space, but don't put garbage there. And now when people see garbage there, they see the crows, and they say, the crows are manifestations of the spirits. And why would you ever even walk around that neighborhood? Right? So getting to see the spiritual and the metaphysical cityscape is really important in Africa. I think it's really important in Hartford. I think it's really important in all of our cities. And just one little example of it, in the south end of Hartford, just outside of an Irish pub, is a memorial to Bobby Sands, the hunger striker of the IRA. This is in the middle of Hartford. Right? And it's a very important spiritual point for the greater Hartford area's significant Irish population. You have all sorts of other things that I could throw in there. It's an overwhelming presence in the cityscape of Hartford to see religious landscapes, whether it's Jewish or Christian or Muslim. Malcolm X founded the mosque in Hartford. He was arrested in Wethersfield, which is a town I live in, on his way out of town. So there are a lot of ways in which these cityscapes are very much all around us. Quickly, these two. In Hartford, you have this building built by Sam Colt, which is a factory you see rotting on the side of the road. It's now being rebuilt into, surprise, surprise, luxury condos. But it is also a part of a new national park, which is the Coltsville National Park, to recognize the innovations and creativity in industry that made Hartford great, the city of Mark Twain and all of that. And I think we see that kind of creativity, innovation everywhere we go. In Africa, several years ago, there was a company that was very successful until it kind of got crushed by the government in Kibera, in Nairobi, that was a toilet company. Because there's just not enough toilets. As one of my friends put it, there are more NGOs than toilets in Kibera. And so this man built a company around pay-as-you-go toilets. And it was Eco Toilet. So they were eco-friendly, they were recycling, using the waste as manure, all these different things that, you know, he just came up with on the side. So we got to do something about this toilet problem. Let's do this. And we'll make money from it, and we'll figure a way to help out our gardens. So you see a lot of different elements of the imagination, the fantastic in African cities that I continue to learn from. And lastly, coming from Dongguan and Guangzhou, seeing the level of influence of cities around the world on each other. We live in a really cosmopolitan time, and this other word is pretty fancy, transnationality, where people identify with more than one country. They are both and. So many of Hartford residents are both Puerto Rican and American. Many similarly more recent immigrants to Hartford come from places like Albania and Bosnia. And they still retain, with social media, with all sorts of financial flows, their connections to those places. And this is becoming more and more the case. And it leads me to argue at the end, to think that African cities belong to the world. So we see the connections across. You can go, it's largely Nigerian food. The Nigerians think, they will one day conquer all of Africa. So African food, it's a Nigerian restaurant in Hong Kong. But you look here and you see, now I said, most of the traders are Malian and Congolese and Nigerian. But the flags on the side of the wholesale, it's a quick flag test for you as teachers, Kenya, Tanzania, Burundi, Uganda, Somalia, Rwanda. So it's all East Africa. I didn't actually see anyone from East Africa. And I heard 3 people speaking Swahili, but they were Kenyan. So it's not necessarily the case that this is a large group, but there is a block of traders who come. They don't necessarily live there, but they will come and buy stuff there. You see increasing numbers of African urban residents learning Mandarin. It doesn't really help them in Guangzhou, which is a Cantonese city, but it's still there. And you come. I had to put this in. Garth, the Art of Cuisine. That's from the Hartford Taste of the Caribbean Festival. So you see an increasing number of influences from around the world, including from Ghana, which is the most significant African population in the Hartford area. I was just in Dakar as well, in Senegal, and the nickname of the Boulevard Centenaire in Dakar is Made in China. In English, Made in China, because it's really becoming a Chinatown. I'm going to stop there to leave some time for questions. Just the last bit is to just look wherever you are in cities all around the US, all around the world, to not lose sight of the fluidity, the flexibility, things that are unpredictable, they're ever changing and surprising in cities. I've spent a lot of time in New Haven, and it surprises me. It might not surprise you if you're from New Haven, but I think it has its quirks and intricacies as well. And I would argue strongly for putting cities on a level plane analytically, to not think African cities are not quite cities, or they're different somehow. Yes, they may be less wealthy, they may have fewer elements of infrastructure, but there are things that we can compare. And especially in terms of elements of policy. And I'll stop there.